So welcome. Thank you. This session is being recorded. My name is Jen Robinson, and I will be the moderator for this session titled Practical Methods in Communicating with Online First-Year Students. Thank you for joining us, and let's welcome Joel Tscherne. Joel received his Master of Library Science degree from Kent State University and worked for Cleveland Public Library most of his career. He also has a Master of Arts degree in history from Cleveland State University. He has worked in a variety of academic roles, including teaching information literacy, history, and film. He has also worked as a university instructional design librarian. In addition to his personal historical study, he hosts the New Books in Film podcast on the New Books Network. Today, we're fortunate to learn more from Joel about communicating with our online first-year students. As we move through, if you have questions, please feel free to post those in the chat. We will return to those in the Q&A session. And Joel, over to you.
Thank you, Jen. I was lucky in that my moderator is someone who I work with all the time. She actually is my lead faculty at UAGC, so that made it a lot easier for both of us, or at least for me. As she said, and as we know, this is the last breakout session of the day, so I'm glad that that everybody that's attending was able to. Being in that last right corner there was an interesting spot to be at, but that's okay. Obviously, as Dr. Robinson listed, I have a varied background as the way I usually describe it, which just meant that I don't seem to be able to stay in one place too long, I guess. Here's our focus for the day, is our introduction, which is what we're doing right now. I'll talk a little bit about my background. She nicely gave pretty much all of it, but I think it's important that you get an understanding of where I'm coming from with many of the pieces that I'm bringing today. We'll talk about what's called the, in quotes, typical online student, and I suspect most of you will understand why that's in quotes. Methods that we currently use for communication or can use depending on your situation. Then a number of personal examples, ways where I have found to be particularly useful for me as I've gone through teaching online in particular. And then finally, we'll talk about the importance of using your previous experiences with students so that you get the most out of specific examples, so that the next time a similar situation comes along, you're starting in a more positive way, more proactive. And then finally, conclusion, and then we'll find some time, hopefully at the end, for questions and or discussions. I'll try my best to watch my watch, because I know I can talk for a while if I'm not careful. So we'll go forward with that. Anyway, and like I say, most of this Jen already talked about, but I still want to at least showed that I had it on my slides. As she pointed out, I've spent most of my career as a librarian. About 20, how many, I don't even know, years ago, I left library work, and then slowly but surely started to transition over into college education. My first work was first started teaching in college in 2008 in Cleveland, Ohio, in a small college. That was live. That's the only live teaching I've ever done, which I still miss to a large extent, doing live teaching, but we know online has its positives as well. I'm currently associate faculty here at University of Arizona, here where we're as hoster, University of Arizona Global Campus, where I teach information literacy and introduction to film. I also am an adjunct faculty in the history department at Southern New Hampshire University, where I teach 3 courses. The first 2 are Gen Ed history courses. We know that Gen Ed, or first year, are the kind of courses where students are often required to take, and sometimes that can have its own issues, particularly on the topic. And then I also teach a class in Civil War and Reconstruction. Worked first public library, also worked academic in a remote for a college remotely for 4 years. And so I have library experience on both ends. And then, as she mentioned, I also am a podcast host for New Book Network. I've been doing that since 2014. So let's start to get into the meat of everything now that I've spent most of my time telling you all about myself. The typical online student. And one of the things I think, having had most of us who teach online have probably had some experience teaching live as well. Maybe not, but I suspect most of us have. And we can pretty quickly have our examples of the differences between an online student, pretty much no matter what school they're going to, and a live class student. So is there such a thing as a typical online student? And believe it or not, I think over time, one of the things I have learned is that the more that you know about your students and what to expect, you start to see patterns. And so it's not unusual that when a student who has one situation, you can compare them at least a little bit in the future in another class to somebody who may have some of the similar characteristics. And that often helps you better deal with issues or communications things that you want to deal with from one person to another. So age. I have taught classes where I've had students, online students, who are literally right out of high school, 18 or 19. And I've also had people who are in their 60s and everything in between. It's not unusual from my experience to see, and I've now gone through teaching in two different educational booms, so to speak, during some financial problems. During the 2008 housing crisis, there was a major uptick in students going back to school. And then we saw the same thing to an extent, during COVID. And so it's not unusual to have seen students either going to a new focus, or like many of our students, they need to get a degree in order to move up in their current jobs. It's sort of unusual. Somebody who comes right out of high school and goes to school, they don't have that particular thing in mind automatically. Work background. Many of our online students, in fact, I'd probably say most, that obviously statistics are probably out there, are already working in a job, at least one job, sometimes more than one. They may be full-time in one job, or they may be doing multiple jobs part-time, which is not unusual, obviously. And they may be working at all kinds of times of the day and night, which we'll talk about in a second. That tells us these folks are going to be a little different, and particularly if you've taught in a college that is where most of the folks who go there, students who go there, are living on campus. This particular issue, while they may have a job on campus, it's not the same as many of our students in the online world, where their work goes on because they're literally going to school from home. Many of our students have a life schedule that can often be problematic for them. They may have family, most likely have a family, or very likely have kids. The job situation, maybe they're working strange hours. It's not unusual that if they're working during the daytime, that means they're trying to get their classwork done at night. If they're a nighttime person, depending on their schedules, they could be logging on any time of the day or night. And we know that. We see that all the time. And obviously that all by itself is a challenge. If you're not at a position to easily contact or be in contact with a student live when their schedule doesn't permit it, it adds to the issue. And then this last one, and I've found that this depends a lot on individual colleges. When I teach at some places, the students often have their technology literacy is good, not great all the time, but good. And then I've had other students who are clearly, and unfortunately, we sort of correlate with that age issue, where depending on their age, they may not necessarily have the computer knowledge or that aspects, and that can be troublesome. And that also, and I don't have it up here specifically, but socioeconomic background. It's not unusual for people who are going back to college. Online seems to be the best way for them to do it, but either the computers they have are old, aren't necessarily in the greatest condition, and so sometimes they have computer issues, and often they're in positions where they can't always solve those problems, and it becomes one more thing that can hinder their ability to communicate with their classwork. As I mentioned earlier, most of the classes, the two of the classes I teach at Southern New Hampshire and the one here, Information Literacy at UAGC, are definitely first-year courses. It's not unusual for some students for it to be their second or third course overall. And so they're still getting their feet wet, so to speak. So depending on the institution you're working for and what kind of training or orientation the students get, you may be dealing with students who are still learning their way around. So how do we stay connected with what we consider to be a typical online student? So some of these are going to be obvious. And in fact, you may get to the end of this program and this presentation and say, well, those are all logical to me. And if that's the case, good, I'm glad, because frankly, I've always been a practical person with many of my work. As I've already pointed out, I spent most of my career in libraries, and even though there's an education component to that, I'm not an educator in the same way as many of you are, who've been in school for education and have taught in a variety of ways. So I tend to be the practical one where I say, okay, what works for me and how do I get it to work? So many of these things may be obvious, but as I say, I'm trying to give some suggestions for those of you who may have issues or even are looking for alternate ways. So the obvious way, some of the ones are the most obvious in the classroom itself. You can communicate with students in the classroom first with announcements. Of course, you're all probably saying, but how do we get the students to read the announcements? And that's a true statement. I agree with you on that one. I know that we spend a lot of time on our announcements, depending on your situation, and you want the students to know that information. And so it can be difficult when you put material up and they don't read it. Obviously, also in discussion threads, depending on where I'm teaching, we often in one class I teach, there is a general discussion thread that sits up there throughout the entire course, that students can just pop in and ask questions. The key is it's open to the rest of the classroom, so people who aren't necessarily interested in their question, might note it but not really say anything. But it also means that students have an obvious place that they can go to. So that becomes another place where if I mention it enough, students will know that it's there. So those are obvious classroom things. Now I'm going to talk in a bit about some of the things that some of the library managements, or excuse me, the learning management systems have available that helps to improve on some of these more obvious ways. The second most obvious way is email. Now, once again, and we'll talk about this in a minute, this can be troublesome for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we don't have the email address they look at the most, and I'm going to talk about that. Sometimes the students don't read their email at all. And there's a variety of reasons that email doesn't always work for us. I'll give you an example going back to the classroom and announcements. At the beginning of every class, I like to send out a quick email to every student in the class and reminding them to read the announcements and so on and so forth. I try to put a video in my introductory announcement when I introduce myself, and I always say, make sure you read all the announcements. And I mention it in feedback to remind students, but it's one of those things where we have to consider other ways to reach students if we're not being able to do it in the way we're used to. Phone and text. And this is one that I know every instructor, every teacher, every professor is going to look at differently. One of the good things about modern 21st century technology is phones now cell phones actually allow 2 lines on a phone, most of the newer phones, what they call dual SIM. So what I did was I went out and bought a real cheap, I don't need to use it except for phone and texting, line that I use in my classroom. I give it to students. I say to them, you can call me on it. You can text me on it. If you leave make sure you leave a message because I might not answer it right away, but at least it gives them one more way to get a hold of me. And then I don't have to worry about, okay, I gave my cell phone number to someone. Maybe you could have a flip phone that could do the same thing, or there's also ways online. Some of the online systems, such as Google and other places, have where you can buy a phone number that you can use, and they can be very, very cheap. It's not like you have to spend a lot of money. But as I say, it allows me to communicate with students. It gives them one more place that they can get a hold of. One of the things I always have to say to students in those situations is, if you call or text me, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I'll even put it in my announcement on my answering the voicemail so that they know I've got your message. Tell me when it's good to call you back. And that can be very important to them because it's always I've had students email me in the middle of the night and say, sorry to email you so late. And when I always respond, say, you can email whenever you want. It's not like I'm automatically reading them all the time at that point. But the same way with phone and text, it just becomes one more place. And as we already talked about with our typical online student, many of our students communicate in a variety of ways. If I was teaching in a class that was mostly students right out of high school, text would probably be one of those ways, would probably be the best way to get a hold of folks. Although I would always try to push them getting back into other ways too. But as I say, it makes me available to them and often allows me to get a hold of them. And then once they know, yeah, I can text him and he'll get back to me, or I can call him and he'll get back to me, then they'll feel more comfortable in keeping in touch. Then the other one, and this is where we have to depend on our institutions and its background, and that's the advisor. We know that in some situations we may not have a good telephone number for the student, so we can't. And the rules about calling students can be you have to be very careful about them. So in some situations, the answer is to either make sure that the advisor is included on any emails. If you can do that way you can keep them in the loop. But another way is if you can't seem to get a hold of the student, just contact the advisor directly. We have to depend on our advisors just as we depend on our librarians and our other folks, our writing centers, to help the students just as much. And by using the advisor, then these are folks who are more likely to talk to that student going forward, and it will help us get a better sense of keeping students in the loop. So let's talk a little bit about some specific examples that I've had in my communications. And these are from when I've started in online, which, as I said, was 2008. I've taught in a variety of different institutions. Right now I'm at 2 places, but I've been at other places. And so the various courses I've taught and the different types of students have helped me get a better sense of how best to reach students. First one, understanding your learning management system, whether you're using Brightspace or Canvas or something else. And each one of them has its positives and negatives, some things that are better than others as far as how they do certain things. The more you understand how to use that system and learn the tricks and the tips that might be available, the better you can use it to stay in communication with your students. And I'll give you a pretty good example right from the beginning. And that's an in-class messaging system. Now, one institution I teach at, we use Canvas. Now, if you've used Canvas as a LMS, one of the things that it has is it's a messaging system right in the classroom. It's private messages. You can send them. They will go. You can reach the student that way. When the student logs on, they'll see they have a message. They also go to their email. The nice thing about this system is it means it's probably the closest you'll get to almost direct communications with a student. They're less likely to miss these messages. And that's why it's so great to have them. You can even send email blasts through the messaging system so that people can respond directly back that way. I always get emails telling me that there's a message posted so I can go on and check. It becomes probably the best way to keep up with my students on a daily basis, and sometimes more than that. And it just works so well, and I'm glad I have it in the one school. And now, like I say, that may be something that other systems have, so you probably want to check and see that. And in other schools, they may have it in the LMS may offer it, but they may not have implemented it. But that's probably what I would consider to be my best example of something that has helped me stay together with my students as much as possible. I can contact the students without using an email address. Doesn't matter. It'll forward it to their email address and they can respond from their email address, but I don't need to have the student's actual email address. And they can respond back to me the same way. That way they don't have to look up my email address. And I don't have to worry that they misspell my last name. And if you remember from the first slide, it's not the easiest name to spell in the world. And I've had students say, I've been contacting you, and it turns out they misspelled my name. So that's something that this kind of thing that allows that. Now, another example is related to email addresses. And this goes back to some of this discussion we've had about contacting students. At one institution I teach at, the only email address I have for students is their school email address. And the problem with that is some students don't check their school email, as you all know. That becomes a problem in the sense that it's much harder for me to know that a student's going to see my messages. So I have to consider that when I'm emailing. Another school, their emails may go to their personal email addresses. In the one school where I don't have access to other email addresses other than their school email, I always post a video at the beginning of each class or each course session that tells them how to set up email from the school on their cell phones. That way they can watch that video, and hopefully, maybe not all of them, maybe only a few, but if even one person figures out, oh, that's a good way to keep up with my school email. Because as many of you probably guess, they probably need to be checking that email for more than just information from you. So having that method, or understanding what your students are going to be hearing, how they're going to hear from you, as I say, that becomes the way to keep them in contact. And that's what I meant about not knowing people's personal email addresses. And I understand that that's the way some schools do it, and that's okay. I mean, but it's just something you need to be aware of so that you know that when you're emailing a student, no matter what, that they're more likely to see it. And then, of course, is how do you get students to read the emails in the first place? And I know that's tough, as usual, just the same one like we were talking about with announcements. And I'll give you a simple method I use. It's pretty much of a sledgehammer approach, but does work. And then once again, advisor email addresses. You need to hopefully be able to find who a student's advisor is quickly. Once again, if you know how to do that already in your LMS, great. But if you've never thought about how do I contact somebody's advisor, now's a good time to figure it out. Most schools, it's not that hard, but if you haven't done it very often, you probably said, I don't remember how to do that. So this becomes an example of the quicker you can get a hold of students, whether it be directly to them or through the advisor, it's a good idea. This is the method that I would call my sledgehammer approach, contacting students from within the grading process. Both places I teach right now, when I'm grading a student's assignment, I can put the feedback into the rubric and into their feedback, but I can also quickly send an email to that student with that same feedback. This is an example of where if a student didn't do well on an assignment, maybe they just didn't understand the directions, I can pretty quickly get in touch with them, because what I will usually do in that case is I won't grade the assignment. I leave it as a 0. And then I email them explaining why, and I also make sure that the feedback includes that. That 0 often gets their attention, because they'll try to figure out, why do I have a 0 on this assignment? Or a very low grade, depending on the situation. The key is, it becomes a way that you can get a hold of a student if you have to. The key, I always, like I say though, is to make sure you send a message to the student or an advisor or both, so that there is a trail as to why you did it. Obviously, if a student didn't do major work in a particular assignment, that can be a problem. Even if you don't put a 0 in, at least by putting it in the basic feedback, the messages, and then trying to email it to them, you may have the ability to get in touch with them that way. So put the information in the actual assignment, but then also send it to them from within the grading process. Provide a lower grade to make sure that students are more likely to respond. Sometimes their first response will be, why did I get a 0? Or a low grade because they haven't read the emails, but that's okay. At least you've got their attention. As I say, that's a very sledgehammery approach, but I would do it in certain situations, particularly in some classes, as many of you probably teach, where there's the stepladder approach, and you want to make sure that they get the early assignments done properly so that it doesn't affect as they keep going. So you want to get in touch with them as fast as you can. So the last thing, and probably the one thing that I've always been a fan of with just about any work I've done, is using previous experiences to help me. We obviously do a lot of grading in our classes. It's so much of the importance of our work is the grading part. For some students, it may be just about the only real major thing they see us, other than some discussion responses. So using experiences are so great. That includes creating files that include example for various issues. Say you run into a problem and you've never had that problem before. Document it for your own records, not because you're expecting to have it happen all the time, but so that the next time it happens, you're ready. It obviously won't be exact, but as I mentioned early on, it's my experience that similarities do occur to a large extent. And having some material prepared, whether it be a sample email, some sample statements, some suggestions that you've already written for somebody else, but you can personalize it for the next situation. Obviously, doing that is something that I do pretty regularly in any kind of grading situation, but you can also use it for this. If I've had problems with one student with the situation, it's very possible the problem may occur again. Experiment with media. Most LMSs now have a reasonably easy way that you can record quick video. And the reason I say that is because some students, you could put it in writing, but it might not click to them the same way that it might if you had a quick video where they could just click on it and listen to you do it. It's not that difficult anymore. Like in both of those places that I'm working right now, their LMSs make it very easy to record video. And as I say, don't assume that the written word's always going to make as much sense to your student as it does to you. Just make sure you give some alternatives. Offer face-to-face meeting options, whether it be on Zoom or any kind of system where you can talk to the student face-to-face, if you have that ability, is something that will often help. I've not had to do it very often. I've had students who wanted to talk on the phone, and they can get long because the student's trying to work things out, but almost every time the student's happy about it. If you do any kind of written communication, include advisors, just because, as I've already mentioned, it means there's one more person in there who's going to help both you and the student. So in conclusion, our students are our customers, and I know we hear that, and I agree. That's not something we want to keep in our focus, but they are. Students have said to me, I'm sorry to bother you in an email, and I always say back, you're not bothering me. That's what I'm here for. But in the same way, you have to think about in your own mind, if you're a customer, consider issues that you went through when you tried to get help, not maybe back when you were in school or even today. We all complain about customer service sometimes, but think to yourself, are you being the customer service person that your students need? Students are happiest when they feel support. They may not necessarily get everything perfect on their assignments. They may go up and down, but at least they'll be satisfied that they're getting the support they need. And yes, it will include that, they will include that praise in their class evaluations. I promise you, I've seen many evaluations where the student has said the fact that I did such and such related to communications helped them and made them feel more steady with their work. So obviously this is the end and we're right on time as far as for discussions. So what I'm going to do is get my chat window up, but if anyone, the most obvious question and the only really specific one I have to you is something that I've mentioned or that I have not mentioned that has been helpful for you. Let's go ahead and see if anybody either wants to raise their hand to ask a question or just go into the chat. Are there situations that you've had that have been successful with connecting with students? And then if you have any other questions or comments, now would be a good time.
Joel, while we're waiting for those questions to be put in the chat or our hands to be raised using the reaction button, one of the things that I really appreciated that you said that I need to practice more is when you do send a message by text or by phone, you add that phrase, tell me when it's a good time to call you back. If that's not rolling out the red carpet for communication, I'm not sure what is. It really does speak to a pedagogy of care that you want to make sure that you're communicating at a time that is convenient for them. I really appreciate that piece of advice to add to my community.
And you're an example of a student on the other side. I mean, you, because of your schedule being ahead of time for many of the students, you're in the opposite situation. You're not necessarily going to be able to call a student back easily at 9 o'clock in the morning their time. Or yeah, that would be okay. But 10 o'clock at night their time's not necessarily going to be easy for you. So mentioning that, just to me, it's just same old thing. Anything you can do to make the situation easier for the student or less stressful is it's the years and years ago I taught a course in the library about, it was a session we did for all public service folks about how to deal with the difficult patron. And the one thing I learned, and we had somebody come in and give us some pointers, the one thing they said is if somebody's angry, the biggest mistake you can make is to stop them in the middle of their anger. Because all they're going to do is start all over again. Let them reach their limit, even if unless it gets, really nasty, but they're angry, let them get their point out. And then the way I heard they explained it was when they start to come down, that's when you break in. And then you can say, so by thinking about the student and what they're going through, it's completely something that should be on our minds at all times. Just think of it from their side. And that's why I think if we consider that ourselves, when we've been unhappy with service, what was it that bothered us the most, and try to do the opposite.
Excellent. It looks like we have a hand raised.
Hello.
I don't want to tell me how to say your name so I say it correctly.
It's Tawana.
Tawana. I was going to say it wrong. So I'm glad I asked.
But I wanted to add to the comment about availability. It's also a good idea to ask them to provide 2 or 3 different dates and times of availability. That way, if the one option they provided is not great for me to reach back out, I have some alternates.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. I agree with you that we just you don't want to play phone tag, and that just adds to frustration. It's just, I always say in my messages where I say to students, please feel free to call me, I almost always will put, the chances are you're going to be leaving a message because, I may not be answering the phone at that moment, but at least they'll know they reached out. Then, of course, you as the instructor or the the person on the other end needs to get back to them reasonably quickly. Sometimes I'll send them a quick text thinking that there's a good chance that they're on a cell phone when they're calling me. Send them a text back saying, I got your message. And if they don't tell me when, that's where I can often ask them. So
Yes.
it may not go through because they may actually be on a landline, but I think statistically speaking, that's almost 100% not likely.
I like that you mentioned just acknowledging you got the message, even if you can't respond right away.
Right.
Steph, I see that you're on camera. Oh, I'm sorry, Tawana, I'm sorry, I did not mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, I'm finished. Thank you.
Thanks.
Steph, I see you're on camera. Did you have a question or just showing us that you're here? Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Joel,
okay.
actually, I really like the comment that Joel made about sharing your experiences. And I think that when we put ourselves out there for our students, you know, giving them access to our number, I like, Joel, how you say, hey, that's what I'm here for. Ask your questions. What I think the struggle I have, and Joel, maybe you can kind of speak to this, is what do we do when we're putting in everything and we're just not getting the responses, like whether it's responding to extended deadlines or replying to emails or maybe not implementing feedback. And it starts to feel like we might even be overwhelming them. Like, how do you know when to kind of dial it back and find that balance? I really struggle with that.
Well, I did a sledgehammer approach before, and I'll do a sledgehammer here. There are some students who don't want to be contacted, and they're not going to respond. And you can only go so far. That's why I say if you get the advisors involved, then it, at least to an extent, falls on the advisor, because if I say I've not been able to get a hold of this student, that's part of what they do, is to try to get in touch with students. And I know you don't want to fail anybody, and that's where you have to say to yourself, I've done my steps, I've done everything obvious. I agree, if you overwhelm, that's going to be a problem. But my often statement is if they're going to walk past a 0 grade on an assignment because they either didn't do it or didn't do it correctly, that's pretty much, you've told them. And the fact that they've not responded, there's not much. Now, unfortunately, what can happen in those situations is you'll get to the second last week of the course, or worse, the last week, and suddenly they'll reappear.
Yeah.
And that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
But I think you have to just say to yourself, this person hasn't done anything since week 1, or didn't respond to any of my emails or any attempts to get in touch with them. I'll let the advisor know they've stopped attending or doing work regularly, and just move on, knowing that they may someday appear again, but at least you've pretty much done everything you can do. And that's hard. We work in a profession where we want to help people. In the same way with, you want to help people, but when you can't get a hold of them or they choose to not accept the help, there's not much you can do.
That's a good point.
Those are hard to accept sometimes. We want to save them all from those bad grades. Are there
and you could run into a whole class that's like that. I've done that in various, I'll have, like at Southern New Hampshire, I usually teach 2 classes at the same time. I will have one class where everybody's up to date, they're participating, they're doing everything. And then the other class, it's like they're all out to lunch. And it's the kind of thing where you have to say, what can I do? You do what you can do best, and then be happy about the successes, and you feel sorry for the ones that didn't go so well.
Yeah.
Joel, in all of your experience working with first-year students, what have you found is the best way to communicate so that they do respond? The ones who are responding, what is the communication method that most works?
Well, and it's UAGC Canvas has the messaging system, and I will tell you, I almost 100% will get a response through the messaging system because within the classroom, because they see the pop-ups either in their email or when they first log on back into the classroom. So if they're going into their classrooms at all, that's tends to be a good way. The other way is when and the other part of that is the fact that if the messages that they're getting are going to personal emails, they're more likely to respond. I think the other thing you have to consider is the ages of the students, as I mentioned before. The younger they are, the less likely they're reading email regularly. And even though we have to try to train them, first year people in particular, you have to say to them, the college is going to be contacting you about important things. If you're not checking your email, you're going to miss it. So, but yeah, I would say anything where I know that the student's most likely going to see it. And so, that to me is the one place that I can say that I've had really great responses because I think students can reach it quickly. They read it right away and things like that. And anything that allows the student to access it while they're in the classroom and see that it's there, I think is helpful.
Okay.
And that's a
Does anybody-
technical thing. I mean, that's an LMS thing. And it makes it tricky depending on your own the school's learning management system.
True. That is the box that we're in, whatever our LMS
Right.
is. Yeah.
Rose.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi. So one of the methods that I use in my class is a 3-forum method. So I have my weekly forums that coincide with the content. I have engagement forums, which are just conversations that pop up during the semester. But what I really am proud about are my guided practice forums. And basically, before an assignment is due, I let students know this is the opportunity to engage and brainstorm with me. And we go back and forth as if, it would be like me standing in the front of the classroom writing on the whiteboard. And we go back and forth and I help them fine tune their assignment before they turn it in. And they know that if they work with me in that way, they're not going to get points for the forum itself, but it will show in the assignment grade that they get. And I actually have had a lot of success in students participating in that.
That's great because like you say, you've figured out a way to deal with sometimes a group of people on a one-by-one basis. And that's great. I mean, I know that I've worked at places where they've had similar type situations that aren't necessarily even part of the classroom, an extra optional thing that allows you to do things like that. The other thing is, and it's one thing I have not done yet, I've not offered in my announcements the willingness to go on Zoom with students to talk about assignments. I'm not sure what kind of reaction I would get. And then of course, that goes back to the whether I should scheduling the time to do it, that kind of thing. So it's something, I don't know if anybody's ever done that where they've regularly told students that if you have questions, feel free to we can work out a date and time for you to do it on Zoom or some other similar system, and whether you've had success with that or not, because I know it's something that would work if the student took advantage of it in many cases. But yeah, Rose, that's a great idea.
Dr. Leah Hagedorn, I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly, would welcome advice on communication strategies with high school sophomores whose parents have registered them for college summer online courses. Oh, have you worked with those dual enrollment?
The only time I ever did was a live class that I taught where we had during the summer, we had students who were just finishing up high school. They started their work a little early, but it was a live class.
Okay.
Wow. I'd have to make sure I understand what the rules are as far as communications too. When there's parents involved for somebody who's under 18, I'd have to go back through my, all of my, those classes that we often have to take, those seminars about communications and privacy to see what I could do. I would assume the parent's going to have, the other thing is in college, we don't have in loco parentis. So there's also that part of it is what is our role at that point and who should, oh boy, that's a tough one.
That is a tough one. And we have come to the end. Joel,
Sorry.
thank you so much. For those of you who were a little late, please, I just went onto podcasts and followed Joel's podcast, New Books in Film podcast. It is on the New Book Network, so you can listen to Joel in his other life. Also, please be sure to fill out the evaluation. Thank you, Joel, for your presentation, for all of you for attending, and please do not miss the closing remarks and the networking event that is coming up next.